All right, so I'm Zeke Jarvis. I am a professor of English at Eureka College and have a few books I've published. My most recent one is a novel, a young adult novel that just came out a couple weeks ago called The Three of Them. I've taught creative writing for almost 2 decades now. So I'm used to working with writers and giving instruction on writing. So I thought that this would be sort of a fun thing to do. I also, there are a couple of reasons why I got interested in choose your own adventure writing. And I'll talk about those a little bit in a minute. But it presents sort of like a particular kind of thing that you can do that you can't do with other just sort of from start to finish narratives. But as I'm talking about this stuff, I just wanted to say that if you have any questions at any point, stop me and let me know, and I'll talk a little bit, ask for some input or some feedback from you, and then we'll do a couple of activities and I'll give a little bit more context and that kind of stuff. And then at the end of this, what I'm going to do is I have emails for both of you, and I'm going to add you to a Google document that I have going, and we'll sort of start our own story, and then we'll kind of build on that story. And at the end of the week, we'll be able to upload a file where anybody who wants to will be able to read through, and they'll be able to choose their own adventure. So it'll be like this happens, and then if you want the next thing to be skeletons, click on this, and then they'll go to the skeleton portion. If you want it to be robots, click on this, and so on and so forth. So at least the three of us and possibly two more people will be building our own choose your own adventure story. So hopefully you'll feel like that's exciting. I was going to do let's introduce ourselves, but obviously Mason and you know each other. Um, so in a minute, I'll sort of still give you a chance to kind of talk a little bit about what particularly interests you about this project. So a couple of years ago, I wanted to do something with my writing where it would get some interest, but also try and help out some charities. So what I did was I started writing this short story, and I would get to a point and then I'd say, if you want the next thing to be robots, donate to this charity. If you want it to be aliens, donate to this charity. And if you want it to be, I'm trying to remember what the third one was, some other kind of monster, zombies, I think, donate to this charity. And whatever charity gets the most money, that's what'll be, that's what the monster will be. And it was all sort of done through Facebook, where you could see this is what you want it to be, and this is where you donate to the charities. So that's kind of where my interest in Choose Your Own Adventure rekindled, but it started when I was a little kid. So here's sort of how Choose Your Own Adventure works. Years and years ago, decades ago, in fact, there was this game, and people still play it, called Dungeons and Dragons. Have you ever heard of Dungeons and Dragons? Do you play Dungeons and Dragons? Okay, cool. So then a lot of this you'll already know, but like with Dungeons and Dragons, you have to kind of figure out how to accomplish tasks, right? You're journeying through, there's this end of the quest that you have to get through, but then the dungeon master will have like put up certain hurdles you have to get over. So maybe there's an ogre you have to fight, or maybe there's a dragon that you have to kind of sneak through and steal his treasure or something like that. And so in Dungeons and Dragons, you have like all the different dice, right? And usually it's a bunch of people playing this adventure instead of just one person playing it. And so that's how Dungeons and Dragons usually works. But if you don't have a dungeon master, you don't have the dice, you don't have, do they still use what's called a monster manual? They do? Okay. So it tells like,
Yes.
yes, okay. It'll tell like, this is the dragon, this is how many hit points the dragon has, this is the kind of attacks the dragon has, and so on and so forth. So if you don't have all that stuff and you don't have a group of people who want to play Dungeons and Dragons, you could have choose your own adventure. And then you still have the same idea where you have a quest that you have to get through, but you don't need the other people and you don't need sort of the other stuff to get through. So I think that's part of what made people start reading and writing Choose Your Own Adventure. Does that kind of make sense? You have this thing that you have to do, and you have all these strategies that you have to use. Now, in order to do that, though, you have to kind of have in mind a breakdown of where you want the story to go. So you know that you have, like, in the beginning, somebody's going to ride into the village and they're going to cause trouble. And then you have these 2 or 3 people who are going to go try and find the princess who needs rescuing or go fight whatever beast is there. And you have to have all the possible things sort of mapped out. And probably not so much anymore, but for a while they also had to kind of have this figured out for video games so that you could kind of figure out how do you navigate through this quest. So when I was a little kid, I read a lot of these Choose Your Own Adventure stories. And so a friend of mine had written a Choose Your Own Adventure story too. And I thought that's kind of cool. And that's kind of why I wanted to start working with this again. So I want to give a couple of sort of general strategies as we work on this. And since you're brothers in some ways, this will make it easier. I don't know, do you two usually get along with each other, or are you pretty competitive with each other? Mason, he's giving a thumbs up, not bunny ears. So I wanted to give like a couple of strategies that you want to use as you're thinking about how these things work. And then we'll do like a walkthrough of like, hey, let's imagine this kind of jumping off point and what are good ideas for leading through it. So the first one comes from what usually is theater improv. And it's the idea that you always, when it's up to you, have to somehow say yes back to the person that you're working with. And here's kind of what I mean by that. So let's say that, again, like the example I gave a little bit ago, at the end of scene 1, the choices for people are, it can be zombies, robots, or aliens. And the next person writes a little section where it is aliens, and we figure out if the aliens are good or bad. It can't be then in the third section you say, well, that was all a dream and the aliens weren't really there, because that kind of cancels out all the work that the person did in the previous section. Does that make sense? So you don't want to say no in any way. You always want to make sure that you're saying yes and then figuring out from that, where can it go? So if you did choose aliens, you could have like the next section be where the person who sees the aliens sees them getting out of their spaceship, and then the aliens start to set up some kind of equipment. And then the next section of the story, you have to decide, are the aliens good and they're going to try and help people out? Are they bad and they start eating people or something? Or is it still not really clear and we need to do a little bit more investigation? So that would be like a logical extension of aliens. Does that make sense? So that's the first thing, is you always have to say yes and kind of agree to what the previous person did. The other thing is that every story that we start, we have to have an end for. So it can't be where it's aliens, the aliens eat people, and then there's no kind of resolution to that. We have to go where either aliens overrun the planet and they've eaten everybody, or we somehow fight the aliens and get them to leave. So there has to be an end point to this story. Does that make sense to everybody? So those are two of the things, and I'll talk a little bit more about genre and other considerations that you'll probably want to think about as you're building on what each person does. But those are kind of the two main guiding principles. So since now I actually know that at least one of you likes Dungeons and Dragons, the example that I was going to use actually might be pretty good, I hope. So imagine that the start of the story is this person gets out of bed, walks out to their yard, and in their front yard is a dragon. That's the end of the first scene. Now, there are different ways that you could run this. It could be that the response is not like, oh no, it's a dragon, but like, oh great, now I have a dragon in my yard again. And the idea is that like dragons are just pretty normal, and the reaction is just sort of like, the same way that, again, I grew up in northern Wisconsin, and every once in a while a bear would wander through our yard. And so if it was pretty close when I would have to go to my summer job, I'd be like, I really hope this bear leaves before I have to go get in the car. And if it got close, then, you know, we'd take pots and pans and bang them, and the bears would usually wander off kind of more annoyed than really scared. But it could be something like that, where a dragon is sort of like a bear in our world. Or it could be that this person goes back to the room, pulls out a sword, and fights the dragon. And so it's going to be an action adventure kind of story. Or it could be that the dragon turns out to be hurt somehow, and it's sort of like the Aesop's fable where somebody pulls a picker out of the lion's paw and they become friends. And so it could be something like How to Train Your Dragon. It could be that kind of a story. So you want to think about very, very different ways that you can take these scenes and sort of build on it. So that was, I come out and there's a dragon in my yard, and 3 different directions that you could get. Let's say instead, it's at night, you wander out, and you find that there are zombies out in the street or out in your backyard. What are some possible avenues you could have as like, this is the next scene? The end is, oh my goodness, there are zombies there. What would some logical sort of next scenes be? And if we go back to how things would usually work in like those Dungeons and Dragons choose your own adventure, a lot of times it would be like, if you fight the zombie, maybe you get bit, and that's the end of the story. So that's one conclusion. If you run, then you're going to have to figure out where to run. So the next scene will be like you running through the woods, and there'll be some kind of fork in the road, and you're going to have to figure out which path do I go down, or you have to figure out how to hide yourself. So those are 2 good options. So there's fight is at least one, run is another one. Any other options or any other possibilities? That's another possibility, is you don't want to run, because if you run, you feel like you're going to get trapped somewhere. So if you find a good place to hide right there, maybe that's the direction that you want to go. So that's good thinking. You want to think about all the possible reactions that you might actually have if you see these things. And so that's a good, I like all 3 of those, and they suggest like different types of story that you might tell. And so it's a way for the reader to feel really connected, because they'll sort of stop and think, yeah, if I saw zombies, what would my reaction be? So I like those 3. So let's say then, to keep going, because this is, again, sort of the yes principle that I was talking about. Let's say that, okay, I picked the fight because I think I'm going to be able to fight the zombies off. There are only 2 of them. And I have like this axe that I usually use to chop down trees. So, and I'll be really, really awesome to chop up zombies. So I'm grabbing my axe and I'm going out and fighting some zombies. So let's say that then the next scene is you fight with the zombies and you chop both of the zombies down, and you hear some rustling out in the woods. And that's the end of the scene, is after you've beat the zombies, you hear rustling out in the woods. What would the next 2 or 3 options from there possibly be? Let's say you could go back inside and call the police, right? Mm-hmm. You're freaked out. You want somebody to come in and have your back with a little bit more firepower than you. So that would be a 3rd possibility. So definitely you could go investigate. And again, that's going to give like a very specific sense of what the reader wants the story to be. The second possibility is maybe like you look on the zombies to see like, is there something magic that made them zombies? Is there some clue to where they came from or something like that? And 3rd would be like, go back inside, call the police, try and just sort of wait it out. And then you can kind of go from there. So we don't have to sketch out the entire story. And I'm not saying that we necessarily have to make it a zombie story that we write. I'll, again, kind of get back to that in a minute. But it's this idea that everything that you start, you have to kind of have a logical resolution to. And one of the most fun things about Choose Your Own Adventure from the reader's perspective is that they really get to feel like they have a part in creating this story, right? And that's a lot different than any other book that you read, where you're just kind of reading, flipping pages. Not that I dislike those. Obviously, if I'm a writer, I like writing and reading, but it's sort of a different thing that you get to do. And so it's fun to try out something different. And in particular, it's sort of fun to do this collaboratively because you don't have to come up with every story. There's something kind of energizing about being able to bounce ideas off of each other. So that makes sense so far? Then I want to talk a little bit about how this is actually going to work. So like I said, I have this Google Doc started, and after class is over, I'll share it with all three of you. I'll probably at least email the other two folks who had signed up and just give them like a really quick overview of kind of what we're doing. And then what I'd like you to do is, you don't necessarily have to come up with all three options for any scene. But if there's one scene and you're like, okay, I really want it to be this, then you can say like, I'm taking story 1A. Does that make sense? And then you write the scene that's sort of like, well, I want it to be where you go out and fight the zombies. So 1A is going to be fighting the zombies. After you get that scene written, the next person, or if you want to do the next scene after that, it'll be 1AA or 1AB. Does that make sense? So like fight zombies, then I write the scene where I've defeated the zombies, and then after I've defeated the zombies, I'm gonna write the scene where there's rustling out in the woods and I'm gonna go investigate it. Somebody else is gonna write 1AB, and that's gonna be I'm gonna search the zombies to see if they have anything on them. Does that make sense? And here's the reason why I wanna do it that way, is eventually we'll have at least one story, possibly more than one story, written all the way through. And I'm going to have it where at the end of each scene, there's sort of, if you want it to be this, click here. If you want it to be this, click here. If you want it to be this, click here. In the olden days, when we didn't have Google Docs or PDFs or things like that, it would just say like turn to page 42, turn to page 36, and so on and so forth. But the way that this is hopefully going to be set up, I'd like it to be where it's just clickable and you can sort of jump to whatever section that you have. And if we have them labeled this way, then I'll be able to make sure that the bookmarks within the document sort of line up and it's all one coherent storyline. Does that make sense? Okay, so it's good. All right, I have at least a couple more things I want to do to just talk about, and then we'll run through another one. So I wanted to talk a little bit about genre, and we've already been doing that a little bit. So the book that you showed me is what's called historical fiction, because for obvious reasons, right? It's fiction, but it's sort of set in a historical period. So even beyond sort of titles of books that you like to read, what are some of the genres that you like to read? Like sci-fi, fantasy, horror, what are some of your favorite genres to read? Probably, maybe neither of you have read any of his work, but probably all of you know there's an author, Stephen King, right? Have you heard of Stephen King? Okay.
Yeah.
So he has a book where he wrote about writing, and some of it is good advice, some of it is not great advice. But one of the things that he talks about is that he had, I believe it was his uncle would fix things, and he had his toolkit. And so what he talks about is the more different genres you read, the more tools you have in your toolkit. Because some genres, like mystery, for instance, to write a good mystery, you have to really, really know how to write plot well. So you have to figure out, okay, how do I make sure that the reader kind of figures out what's going on? Whereas like in fantasy, for instance, it's maybe not so much about the plot, but maybe it's a lot about either the characters or the descriptions. It's oftentimes what's called world building. So like, do you guys like Lord of the Rings if you like fantasy? Do either of you, my daughter is really, really into Harry Potter. Did either of you read or like the Harry Potter series? So there, what I mean by world building is like, you follow Harry, who doesn't know anything about the magical world, right? And so you figure out things about the magical world or learn things about the magical world at the same time that he does. So he doesn't know anything about like how a wand works, or when he first sees Hedwig, it's like weird that you would have a pet owl. And so that kind of world building is something that if you read a lot of fantasy, you start to figure out how to do because you see how other authors do it. I'm not as familiar with this, but probably like Percy Jackson would be another one where you can kind of figure out like the sorts of references that he makes and how he takes an established world and figures out how to put it into like our type of world. So all this is like the more genres that you read, sort of the better writer that you'll eventually be, because you'll see how people do different things. So if you don't have a favorite, that's totally okay. And in a lot of ways, that's good if you want to be a writer. So anyway, the reason why I'm bringing this up is that before, when we talked a little bit about the always saying yes, you want to think about what genre it is that has happened so far. And in the early going, you can have very, very different genres. But once you've been going for a while, you want to be careful not to mix genres too much. So let's go back to the zombie example. If you wanted to have like a way, way different story, you could be where you go out and challenge the zombies to a dance-off. And that the zombies, for some reason, do really want to be in this dance-off. And then you defeat the zombies in the dance-off, and now you're like master of the zombies because you somehow outline danced them or something. That would be a way, way different kind of story than people would expect, right? But it would give a chance for like, if you want this to be a funny story, I'm going to do the dance off. If you want it to be an adventure story, then I'm going to have fighting the zombies with an axe. If you want it to be where this is a relatively realistic and kind of scary story, then I'm going to stay in my house and kind of hide because I would be too chicken to go out and fight zombies in the real world, right? So in the early going, you can think a little bit about like, well, what genre do we want this to be, and what different genres could this be? Make sense? Okay. All right. The last idea that I wanted to get out there, and then this will again lead to kind of a little brainstorming session, is this. The examples I've given so far have been kind of like monster type examples or horror type examples, and that's totally fine. And the reason why I gave those is partially because, again, like a lot of the choose your own adventure stuff that I read when I was a kid was either sci-fi or it was fantasy. And again, I think a big reason for that is because a lot of the folks who like Dungeons and Dragons kind of gravitated towards the choose your own adventure format. The other nice thing about choose your own adventure is that you can read them many, many times. And so you kind of get like 3 or 4 books in one. So when I was a kid, I had another choose your own adventure book that was not Dungeons and Dragons. It was like King Arthur and Merlin. And one of the things that it didn't do very well is sometimes it would sort of like force you to make a specific choice where it was really, really obvious which choice you should choose. And those aren't quite as fun. And so if you have it where like they're very different, but all things that a reader might enjoy reading, it's just a little bit more exciting to work through it because you feel like you, the reader, are building the story instead of just being told like, okay, well, you know, fight the zombies, put some metal in the microwave, or go eat your socks. And then like, well, obviously I have to go fight the zombies. So having 3 like really good ones is a good idea. I guess that brings up one other point that I want to make sure that I give. As you're writing these, once you finish the scene, the place that you want to end the scene is where there's like a legitimate choice. Do you understand what I'm saying there? Mm-hmm. And it's up to you if you want to say what the choices are, or if you want to leave it up to the next writer to sort of say, well, here's what I think a good choice would be. So again, to think about the zombie example, it could be where you say, do you fight the zombies, whatever, whatever, or it could be where just you see zombies and you recognize this is a moment where the character is going to have to make a choice, and so you leave it up to the next writers to sort of figure out what the next choice is. So if you want to give the choices, that's totally fine. If you want to leave it up to the imaginations of everybody else, that's fine too. All right. So I want to get back to the thing that I was going to bring up. I've so far talked a lot about like fantasy and horror and that kind of thing. Don't be afraid to have this be like a completely realistic story. So let me give you one more example, and then we'll kind of brainstorm through what the possible options would be. You could have where the start of the story is you're in like middle school and you have to go to, you know what a school assembly is, right? You go in the school into like the gymnasium, and let's say in the story the principal is really mean and really harsh, and he's yelling at the kids, and then finishes his rant by saying like, and I better not see anybody misbehave for the rest of the school year. And then all of a sudden a big spit wad hits the side of his head, and he turns to see who did it, and that would be a good moment to cut the scene and let the next person supply the idea. Does that make sense? So let's say that a big spit wad hits the principal's head. He turns to look at who it is, and what would some of the possible things be that could have shot a big giant spit wad?
Well, it could be just like, I don't, I guess a bully. Just,
That's the most logical choice, right? A bully or a troublemaker, right? Mason,
yeah.
how about you? What would some other possibilities be?
The cafeteria lady?
That'd be a good one. I like that. Maybe the cafeteria lady likes the kids, finds the principal to be kind of a jerk, and wants to make sure that the principal gets his comeuppance. So, like, idea. Any other possibilities? That's right. It could be something where, again, we establish what the genre is because we say, you know what, I want it to be a spit wad firing robot, or I want it to be a monster who even the monster recognizes that the principal's kind of a jerk, and so he's going to toss a spit wad at the principal. So as you think about like what should we do next, let it be like pretty wild, you know. And in particular, as you write the next section, you want to be careful not to write a section that somebody else is probably going to write. Does that make sense? Might want to think about like what would be really the wildest turn to have in this moment. So I like the lunch lady. That would be a nice surprise. It's probably a good idea in some ways to have like a logical one, like it's a bully. Could be another teacher. It could be that it was actually the best student in school, and then now we have to figure out in that next section, why is the best student in school tossing a giant spit wad at the principal? By the way, don't shoot spit wads at your principal when you get to go back to school, or you'll get in big trouble. But anyway, so the couple of things I want you to take away from that are, number one, don't be afraid to try something really, really surprising, because that can make the story interesting. It can be that the reader wants to see like, oh yeah, what's going to happen next? As long as it's in line with everything that's come before, as long as it's saying yes to everything that's come before, you should be in pretty good shape. Then in the Google Doc that I'll have, that I'll share with you in just a little bit, I have two sort of prompts that are started, or two chunks of story that are can be built on if you're interested. If you're not interested in that, in either one, don't worry about it. You can absolutely start your own. Once we have like 2 or 3 beginnings, start reading what the other folks have read, and you can sort of build on those. But again, just make sure that you sort of track like, okay, this is section 1, and this is storyline A, and then this is storyline AA, and so on and so forth. So just make sure that you're kind of following that. And again, make sure that every story line eventually comes to some kind of end. So be looking at like the sections that don't have ends yet, and figure out if there's something that you can kind of build on it. So I'm going to pop back to Nate for just a bit. We, by Saturday, would like to announce that there's some kind of file that everybody can read if they want, right?
Yeah, so next Saturday evening at 7 p.m. we're going to do sort of our final, everybody come together, showcase what you've worked on. We'll announce the winners for one of the contests, and then hopefully be able to say, hey, we've got these, whether it's one or maybe if we end up with a couple of different ones, we've got these choose your own adventure stories that you can go right now to the website and you can click on them and you can start reading them. And so that's our hope. It's not a big deal if we end up not being able to do that, but it'd be nice to have at least one of them done by maybe noon on Saturday or something like that, just so we have something to show people. So.
Thank you. So for that to work, like my next Saturday is pretty open. So in the morning and afternoon, I should be able to get stuff formatted and saved and sent along to Nate. But probably like by Friday night, all the actual text, all the actual storyline should be in. A couple things I want to make sure just are clear and make sense is that, like I said, every storyline has to have a conclusion. If we have like 4 storylines that don't have conclusions, probably I'll cut one of them at some point. But if there's just like one that doesn't have a conclusion, I'll just write it, and I'll be contributing too on and off over the week. I don't want to dominate this. I don't want to make it seem like, hey, this is my work and you're not allowed to touch it. So I'll be chiming in when there's a storyline that hasn't progressed yet, but probably like by Friday night, most of the storyline should be wrapped up. And again, if there's just one Saturday morning that's not done, I can just write the end of that and I'll be fine too. So anyway, by Friday night, everybody's contributions will need to be in there so that Saturday I can put everything together. And I'm happy to have, like I say, 1 story, 2 story, 3 story, but just anything that we start, we have to finish. And with that, I guess there's one other point that I want to make sure that I get out there. Because this is a collaboration, it's a lot different than like writing your own story. So in particular, like I said, there are a couple other people who had originally signed up for this, so it's possible that somebody else might be popping in partway through. We can't, like, none of us individually own this story. Does that make sense? So we can't say, like, we can't put a comment on the Google Doc saying, well, you're not allowed to do this, or, hey, can you delete this section? Part of the deal is that we're working together, and so we're all kind of trusting each other to, put in stuff that's in line with what the story is trying to do. Does that make sense? I don't think I need to say this, but this is, my vision for this is like a PG-13 rating, certainly nothing over PG-13. That's a big thumbs up from Dad. Nothing that would be in like Game of Thrones or HBO or something like that. Anything that's on network TV, mostly we should be okay with. So anyway, like I said, in just a bit, I'll share with you the Google Doc, and then you can kind of get going. You can put in as much as you want. You can add as many storylines as you want. I think it makes sense as we do this to not have more than 3 options for any scene. 2 is okay. If there's one where it makes sense to have 4, we could have 4, but if there's like 8 options, the storyline is going to start to get too hard to manage. So, 2 or 3 at the end of each scene is sort of how it should go, I think. I also, I'll email each of you to let you know, like, Google Docs up, and so you'll have my email. If you have any questions over the course of the week, please feel free to reach out to me.